There are many races in this world, and there are people who know how to improve themselves. There are different types of werewolves, such as spiders or bats. And also demons are intelligent beings with their own powers and orders. Anyone can become a celestial being and achieve unlimited possibilities. Someone will become a godmother, a celestial being, beautiful and cheerful. And the other will turn into a strong and courageous Mistress Noiva, the creator of people. You can even choose the type of creature for yourself, for example. Become a beautiful phoenix or another dangerous monster. But you can also stumble upon a strange atavism. The sun illuminated the huge gates at the entrance to the city. There nearby, people were gathered, listening to the words of the wise gentleman. And someone did not interfere and stood nearby and watched this. He easily spat watermelon seeds out of his mouth. Relaxed in a chair, wearing sunglasses, he chewed a ripe fruit, thinking about how low the threshold for becoming a celestial was. His name was Ye Changqing, and he was in a novel about celestials, but something went wrong. It was 5 years ago that he suddenly found himself in the middle of a beautiful mountain landscape. At first, the guy decided that he had traveled in time. In his dreams, with the help of the system, he will be able to arbitrarily dispose of laws and engage in obscenities with partners in Taoist practice. His eyes sparkled at these fantasies and drool rolled down his chin. Raising his hand, Changqing confidently called out to the system. But no one answered. Only the birds screamed as they took off. He fell to his knees and cried, trying to call at least someone, a boss, a teacher, contacts. It was all useless, and after some time the guy barely made it to the nearest town. Immediately, he met an old man sitting in front of a sparkling blue ball who offered to measure the root of life. Of course, Changqing wanted to check. Approaching the ball, he touched it and immediately received a small electric shock. The ball sparkled, and the old man, seeing something there, could not believe how this was possible. The guy, full of confidence, asked to quickly tell him whether he really possessed such a powerful talent. However, it turned out that there was no root of life in him at all, and people immediately crowded around, surprised that such a person existed. So Changqing began to travel around the world, but not a single clan wanted to accept him. He knocked on the doors of all the sects and asked to take him, but without the root of life, no one needed the guy. In order to somehow survive, he found a small village. Lost in the mountains and eternally covered in fog, it was called the village of Xiaoqi. There, on one of the streets, Changqing opened his own shop to earn money for food. Drawing on knowledge from both worlds, he began to teach and run a household, and his days passed very calmly. Because the guy stopped striving for anything and resting more, his creative abilities rapidly increased. Changqing discovered many talents within himself, such as becoming a master of calligraphy, learned to play Go masterfully and defeat all opponents. Even playing string instruments came easy to him. It made me wonder if he had discovered his special skill in this world. But the guy was not at all happy with such abilities and enraged threw the brush on the table, breaking it. After all, evil spirits are rampant in this world. So what benefit is there in practicing art? His disciple sighed and said, Mr. Ye has once again indulged in his worthless fantasies. Hearing this, the guy froze, remembering that he was not alone here. Embarrassed, he closed his eyes and cleared his throat, trying to pull himself together. Hitting the board with his pointer, Changqing began to tell what they would talk about in today's lesson. However, the class was not at all ready for the lesson. The children scattered in all directions, some started fighting, others laughed and chatted. Of course, this behavior angered the teacher and he shouted at them, clenching his fist. And the students began to explain that a celestial being had come to the village to look for students and that their parents had told them to go to her to improve themselves. Another boy's father considered improvement more important than studying, and he asked if Mr. Ye also wanted to improve himself. The angry Changqing shook from such rudeness, but the children immediately apologized. He understood that these little kids still didn't know anything about respect. But then someone said, "We'd rather just laugh in front of you." And the guy was again overcome with anger and a desire to scold this child. And then a cry rang out. "The celestial being is here!" The guy couldn't hold on and fell in the passageway. And the children, wanting to see the girl as soon as possible, said goodbye and stepping on him quickly rushed to the exit. They ran into the city in a noisy crowd and Changqing could only shout furiously after them. On the widest street in the city, many people had already gathered to greet the arriving celestial being. She was a very beautiful girl and the main disciple from Taishuan Shrine, and her name was Lu Wu Shuang, and behind her was another beautiful younger girl, her fellow disciple Wang. The parents who vaccinated their children bowed low in greeting. With a wave of her hand, the girl ordered the selection of Taishuan's disciples to begin, and the servants who came with her obeyed her. A queue was organized and all those who wanted to stood one after another. A ball hung above the ground, and the servant opened the notebook when the first person approached and asked the child's name. The mother of the boy, who was shamelessly picking his nose, beamed and said that his name was Li Gusheng. Looking at him, the servant decided that children were no good in this place and that they had come in vain, but he still asked what the child's official name was. With an embarrassed smile, the woman replied, "Its name is Li Chunfeng." Hearing this name, Xuan turned around to see who was called that. The mother was surprised. "What's the matter? Is there something wrong with my son?" But the girl explained that she simply thought the name was very beautiful. Then the aunt told him about Mr. Ye, the smartest man in their village, who called him that. Xuan couldn't even imagine that such a Taoist expert could live in this place. Perhaps he could even walk the path of cultivation. Meanwhile, the servant asked the child to place his hand on the spiritual stone. The boy approached and took his finger out of his nose and placed his hand on the glowing blue ball. The next moment, he flared up like the sun, blinding everyone around. The shocked girl looked at the assistant, whose list in the notebook also began to glow like gold. It turned out to be a top-grade spirit root, shining like metal. And the boy, not understanding everything, began picking his nose again. Looking at him, the younger student admired, because such a type is extremely rare and people with him are considered incredibly talented. "What a good sign. Let's move on," the older student ordered. The children stood in a row and began to say their names, and they were all beautiful and strong. As the younger student wrote down their lines, they began to sparkle more and more. He was amazed at the tremendous luck that these names brought. The astonished Xuan turned to the boys, asking who had called them. The children answered without hesitation that these names were given by Mr. E. Meanwhile, Mr. Ye himself was nearby and was able to see a golden glow from behind the houses, immediately realizing that this was the light that the soul root of the highest quality possessed. He remembered telling the parents of his students that their children would never become celestials. As a result, seeing this light, the guy felt like a real laughingstock. The next morning, 2 students from Taishuan were walking around the village, the younger one happily jumping ahead. "These candied fruits are so delicious, no wonder there are so many talents here." But Shuang said that she had been here before and had not seen anything outstanding. Wang showed her sister the skewers of fruit that were almost perfect. The girls looked at the nearest shop, which was called Changqing's shop. When the senior student read the hieroglyphs, they seemed to separate, glowing with a golden light. The shocked girl froze in place, thinking that this was bad. Golden inscriptions surrounded and penetrated her body. Once in her head, Shuang entered a space filled with swords. Wang worriedly tugged the hovering elder's sleeve, asking what was wrong with her. When the girl woke up, she happily exclaimed, "I just entered the 6th level of the golden sword scroll." The younger one was amazed, because the teacher said that it takes 70 years to do this. Shuang didn't expect that just by looking at the hieroglyphs, her skill would increase so much. Apparently, the one who made the inscription was a great expert in the way of the sword. She grabbed Wang's hand and invited him to go inside the shop with her. When they went inside, the girls met a guy who was doing calligraphy. Coming out from behind the table, he greeted his guests and the senior student admired his taste. However, she felt that this person was not perfecting any skill and thought that he was ordinary. And Chang Qing, seeing her elegant clothes and makeup, realized that she served the Celestials and decided that such rich clients would definitely give a lot of money. And he said, "Look around, dear guests. The things here are beautiful. The prices are modest. We are not deceiving anyone." The girls walked around the store, and then the older student noticed something. There was a stunning painting hanging there, a portrait of a young man. An incredible power emanated from him, aiming at Shuang. Feeling that this was not good, she grabbed her sword. Blocking the powerful force of this picture, the girl could not resist it. And then the energy of the sword began to penetrate her body and fill her mind. Xuan closed her eyes and froze in place, her body trembling. Suddenly, she realized that she had advanced in cultivation again. The older student ran up to the shop owner and grabbed his hands, asking, "Who painted this picture and what kind of person is depicted in it?" The guy saw her happy face and decided that she was definitely going to buy the painting, and was even interested in the author. Smiling happily, he realized that it looked like he would be able to sell his self-portrait for a good price today. "I'm embarrassed to admit it, but the author of this painting is me, Ye Changqing," said the owner. Stunning the girls, he confessed, "This drawing is just a self-portrait, a sketch on which I am practicing." However, Xuan was so delighted with the painting that she couldn't believe it. After all, the sword spirit and fire on it are not at all the level that an ordinary practitioner can achieve. The boy was sad and apologized for disappointing the 2 beautiful fairies. The younger student upset him even more by saying, "It's just superficial, the hair, the clothes, just something not worth paying attention to." Xuan tried to object to her younger sister. Since she was still young, she did not understand the true meaning and was talking nonsense. But this only made the guy wonder if she really didn't understand. And the girl thought, this man is young and has an attractive appearance and energy, so why does he have an infinite sword spirit in the picture? She was interested in Changqing, who did not feel spiritual energy. He could deliberately suppress the power. Otherwise, why in the shop even a self-portrait helps to rise? Bowing low, the beauty introduced herself. I am a disciple from the sacred place of Taishuan, Lu Wu Shuang. I ask you, senior, to forgive my ignorance. However, the boy admitted, Madam, I am just an ordinary mortal, don't call me senior comrade. But in his heart, he wanted to stop this false respect, not intending to bargain. The girl was incredibly surprised that having so much spiritual energy, one could call oneself a mere mortal. And then she realized that since the respected elder had such abilities, his solitude here had a deep reason. She was afraid to say the wrong thing and reveal the secret because it would certainly irritate him. And Changqing was thinking, why is this girl so polite to him? Does she really want to use the store for free? Whereas for the girl, he was a strong personality with whom one had to communicate carefully. And she said, you know, I've been into painting since I was a kid and your work has inspired me, so I want to use the word senior. These words made Mr. Ye delighted. He may not have had spiritual strength, but when it came to art, it was simply beautiful. He asked the girls not to be shy and to enjoy the walk, showing them the various assortments of the store. The younger student had many questions about the branches in the pot, which were bonsai, and the dry and sticky fruits in the jars, which were actually homemade snacks. She also came across a naked, armless female sculpture, and Changqing said that it was the most beautiful woman in the world. Xuan also approached the statue, and at first glance this image seemed offensive to her. But inside she saw indescribable beauty. The girl realized that it was impossible to achieve the ideal even if the limbs were restored. She was fascinated by the understanding of the world of sages and hermits. The many questions from curious ladies irritated the guy, since it was unclear whether they were going to buy something. But then Wang approached him with 2 wooden hairpins, asking how much they cost. Then, Mr. E raised 3 fingers, connecting his thumb and index finger. The girls said they understood, but Changqing didn't care how much they paid in 3 silver coins or 3 spirit stones. He would still end up in the black. The students looked at each other and began to think that for such an incomparable person to exchange treasures for worldly things would be an insult. For Shuang, the guy's gesture seemed to represent an infinite number of laws, and the 3 fingers pointed to the levels of life, while the circle, a symbol of fullness, had the shape of a coin. Everything became clear to her. He just needed to give him the coins. And the girl handed the stunned seller 3 copper coins. At first, he didn't understand that this was the entire payment, but soon it dawned on him that he had only been given 3 coins. The upset boy, who would now have to feed on air, considered the cultivators to be incredibly stingy, and the senior student was only glad that she did not let her sister use spirit stones and hurt the higher beings. Pointing to the painting, Shuang wanted to buy it, and Changqing could only smile. His hand holding the coins was shaking with anger because he had painted the portrait with such skill, and they were unable to truly appreciate the art. The guy had a hard time enduring it because relationships are important in spiritual practice, but he put together a picture for his girlfriend. Looking at him with admiration and wanting to hear the master's wisdom once again, she said, Senior, will I be able to come to you for advice in the future? Mr. Ye had to agree, although he did not want such a woman to leave him without payment again. When the 2 lovely ladies left the shop, sunset was approaching. Smiling, Shuang hummed something to herself. Surprised, Wang asked why she was so happy, and the senior disciple replied, I just reached the 7th level of the Golden Sword Scroll. This amazed the younger sister, and at first she thought that the girl was joking, because if the 6th level requires 70 years, then the 7th level requires at least 200 years. She asked, is it because of that handsome shop owner? And Shuang confirmed that this senior was indeed an outstanding person. With a heavy sigh, the girl said that this man possessed no small amount of strength. Stroking her younger sister on the head, she added, I don't know if it's good or bad, but I'm under his influence. Then a light appeared under the girl's feet, and a whirlwind of air swirled around them. Flying up on the sword, Shuang said, Let's go. First, let's take the disciples to the sacred land to take part in the test. I have to think about how to inform the master and elders about this. And Changqing was already walking home, thinking about how these students were all getting the attention of the gods, and the painting was sold for pennies. He made everything even worse, and now he would have to wait for it all to end. On the way, he stopped by Wei restaurant as usual. The owner greeted the guy warmly. asking whether he would have the same 3 dishes for dinner again that day. But the upset Mr. Ye changed his order. "I didn't earn much today, just 2 appetizers and a jug of wine will be enough." Then the owner hugged Changqing, saying that thanks to him, their Wei family became successful. Such politeness surprised the guy, and he immediately thought that Li Leng had already left, and Mr. Wei, pouring wine, said, "Yes, all the children in our town left, and the teachers praised their choice of names, especially Li Leng." Sitting at the table, he continued the conversation. The spiritual teachers froze in place upon hearing the name Wei Zhongxiang, and the guy proudly replied that he had chosen this name with particular care. The man patted Mr. Ye on the back, assuring him, "Even though you don't have spiritual strength, you do have culture." Of course, the guy was very grateful for such words, and the owner ordered the teacher to be served a chicken thigh. Changqing was already about to start eating. Taking the fragrant meat, he was about to put it in his mouth, but then a strong blow landed on his stomach, causing him to drop his hip. Visitors looked at the large black-tailed dog in surprise. The guy straightened up with difficulty and couldn't believe what had happened. A dog named Black Emperor looked at him, wagging his tail and holding meat in his teeth. The restaurant workers came out to look and asked, "Is this the dog that got lost last year?" The guy confirmed this, and the dog began to lick the owner's face. Covered in drool, he fought off the happy dog with difficulty. 2 years ago, Changqing picked up this small black dog of an unknown breed and named it Black Emperor. He fed him scraps, which the dog didn't like at all. After some time, he disappeared, making a hole in the wall, and the guy thought that he had already become a snack for wild animals. Now all of Mr. E's pants and boots were covered in drool. He irritably called his pet a licking dog, but he still looked at his master with the same devotion and barked. Upon entering the house, the dog immediately rushed forward. He sat down next to a huge painting of a dancing dog, which surprised Changqing. The dog was shaking terribly, and the boy remembered that he had been just as afraid before and wanted to examine the canvas. Before going to bed, Mr. E warned the dog, "Your kennel is in place, don't keep looking at the painting, otherwise you'll get scared again and shit yourself." The pet watched attentively as the door closed behind its owner, and then a golden aura flared up around him. The emperor's body began to show bulging muscles, and he stood up on 2 legs. The dog did not expect that after being tempted by the fox, he would be able to return to his master. He recalled with anger how the vile fire demon had teamed up with others to return him to his original state. Suddenly there was a knock from behind the door. The dog was afraid that demons from the southern mountains had come, but Changqing's hand appeared from there, holding out a bowl of food, and he said, "There's still some food left, eat it, and then sleep." The emperor, who was incredibly happy, regretted leaving his master and promised to be the best dog and never run away. And the guy, lying in bed, thought about how his pet had spent this year away, even though his stately figure and cowardly nature had remained unchanged. Turning on his side, he thought that he had made a mistake in taking the dog as a model when he painted that picture. Then he hoped the dog would become a demonic ruler. But he turned out to be just a licker. Behind the door, the emperor ate his food and no longer worried, because thanks to the master's protection, all the demons would be ants. While licking the plate, the dog thought about his fate, which was determined by the picture created by the owner, and awakened the blood. However, this time he did not bring Mr. Ye a gift and decided to slip away and make a surprise. So at night, a black shadow flashed over the sleeping Changqing, and then came a clear, warm morning. The guy began to slowly wake up and open his eyes. He rubbed his face, and it seemed to him that the bed became smaller. Mr. Ye touched something soft and warm with his hand. Turning around, he was shocked to find a sleeping girl on the bed next to him. She was very beautiful, with fair skin and blonde hair. The horrified and embarrassed boy screamed, "Woman!" The blonde's leg pressed against Changqing's groin, and he screamed. Looking at the girl, he tried to understand what was happening. At first, Mr. Ye thought he was dreaming, and he slapped his hand on her thigh. The feeling seemed very real to the happy guy. But then the 9th Princess Yang Yingxing woke up after feeling the blow. The shocked girl looked around, realizing that she was not alone here. Changqing sat next to her, smiling, and greeted her. However, she did not wait for his words and waved her hand, slapping the guy with all his might, leaving a mark. Mr. Ye fell out of bed with a bang, and the princess asked who he was. Pointing her finger, she began to shout, "What are you doing in my bed? You know who I am?" The confused and frightened girl called for security, ordering them to seize the man. Holding her cheek, Changqing comforted her and explained that this was his home and his bed. The screams could be heard even on the street where the Black Emperor sat wagging his tail. The happy dog found this lively and thought his owner was having a good time. And then Jan stood up and said, "Get out of here," and kicked the guy with incredible force. From such a blow, he flew out the door, landing on his back. The dog ran up to Mr. E, barking. He wanted to know if the owner was happy with the gift, but he didn't understand him and only scratched his head, wondering where this girl came from. Changqing looked sternly at the dog and reprimanded him for allowing someone to enter, and the dog only barked in response, but in fact, it was he who brought her. Meanwhile, the princess was sure that yesterday she had slept at the courier station since she ended up here. Was it really because of this guy? But when Yang hit him, the gentleman didn't look like he had the strength to overcome his defenses. And the girl decided to be cunning, and if he had bad intentions, she would kill him. Shoes clattered on the wooden floor as the princess stepped outside. Standing in the middle of the yard, she began to look around doubtfully. But everything around was completely empty and there was only a small table at which Mr. E was sitting. Jan called out to the focused guy at the top of her voice, but he didn't respond. She hurried towards him with quick steps. The girl didn't expect that the thief would still be here, and even playing chess in a cultured manner. She reached out her hand to smash his go board, but her limb began to tremble, and the princess froze, not understanding what was happening. A strange light emanated from it, and she had to cover her eyes. The energy of this party was incredibly huge. It seemed like Jan's head was going to explode, and she called for someone to help. Finally, Changqing noticed that someone had approached. He looked at the girl's twisted face in amazement. She had slept all night, and now she was like this. Was she really trying to deceive him? The dog also noticed the strange behavior of the guest. But he knew that his master's party was covered by countless streams of energy, and not many could withstand it. And yet it was his gift, and this time he decided to help. Meanwhile, in the illusory world, the darkness began to crack. From there, breaking through the darkness, a huge black dog burst out. The girl looked at him in horror, not expecting anyone to break through to her. She realized that it was the dog who helped her deal with this trap. However, this was not the end, and Yang began to fall into the dark infinity. From fear and strong spiritual pressure, she lost consciousness. The Black Emperor rushed forward, realizing that her soul and body were separated. But the real god here was Mr. Ye, and by easily moving the pieces, he helped the girl get out. In reality, he was simply playing a game. Concentrating on the game, the guy was glad that he was finally able to solve this game. Finally waking up, the princess fell to her knees, exhausted. She was shaking. She felt her soul leaving her body, as if through the gates of hell. Raising her head, Yang saw the dog and decided that since he helped her get out of the illusory world, he must be of a powerful level. If it weren't for this dog, her soul would have left long ago. And the emperor believed that the master's strength was largely responsible for saving the girl. Then Changqing noticed that something was wrong and turned to the guest. "Are you okay?" The girl looked at him silently and couldn't believe that this guy was so strong, even subdued a black demonic dog. She thought with admiration that this was the hidden power that was spoken of in the books. But the next moment the princess drooped. She definitely couldn't do anything to him. And Mr. Ye, shocking Yang, suggested, "Maybe you are good at Go. Since you were staring at the board for so long, let's play a game." With difficulty, she began to rise. She remembered the instructions of the old men, who said that powerful people have strange morals. Apparently, the girl had offended him in some way, and now it was better to surrender immediately. She folded her arms and refused, not daring to do anything in front of her elder. However, Changqing smiled at this, surprised that he was called a senior again, and said, "It's okay. I haven't had much to do these years, so all I can do is immerse myself in techniques." It seemed to the girl that his skill had reached its peak, and he had nothing more to improve. Meanwhile, the guy was already setting up the pieces, asking her name, and he asked where she was from. And the princess, looking at him, felt incredible charm and attractiveness. She was unsure whether to reveal her true identity, so as not to cause trouble for her father, the emperor. Reaching for the other figures, Mr. Ye said, "It seems that your clothes and appearance are unusual. You probably also practice the art of cultivation. Were you someone's apprentice?" And Yang admitted that she simply received guidance from a few teachers at her home. "I understand," Changqing replied calmly, continuing to fill out the board. But in his heart, he was furious because ordinary people couldn't afford several art teachers, and she didn't even think about leaving. They sat silently opposite each other while the boy finished setting up the pieces. Finally, he completed his arrangement by placing the last one. And he asked, "Yan, how do you think the blacks will get out of this situation?" Looking at the board, the girl saw that they were trapped. But suddenly she was again plunged into an illusory world. She felt the mighty roads of the world. The princess fell into the path of fate. Like shining carp in a sea of stars, great powers surrounded her. Only unlike last time, this path seemed more friendly to Yang. Breathing heavily, the enchanted girl could not utter a word, and realized that she had reached the transition through the step. The worried guy called her by name, and she was finally able to come to her senses, opening her eyes. The princess stared in admiration at Mr. Ye, who was waving his hand in front of her face, not understanding what was going on. He sighed and decided that it seemed like all the cultivators were a little out of their minds. After apologizing, Yang asked what kind of game Changqing was playing, but the guy silently stood up and turned away from her. He waved his hand and replied, "I was just bored, so I decided to have some fun." And, a little embarrassed, he added that he was playing tic-tac-toe. Remembering the arrangement of the pieces on the board, the girl could not believe that it was such a simple game. She wanted to look at the board again, but the emperor held her back, because next time he might not save the princess. However, she still reached out, wanting to know the truth. In the mountains of this world, one could also see Taishuan, the sacred land of the Tao Paths. And on a high hill, the Gifeng Temple could be seen. There was a crowd inside. Someone was shouting, "Your temple must be excluded." The tall elder, Saint Guifeng, Chang Xuan tried to calm his younger brother, but Hezui Quirin continued to assert, "My subordinates are mainly from lands where spiritual energy has been depleted, so for several hundred years, no good recruits have been found. Today, Mount Taishuan has reached its weakest state." The smiling man, Juyu Mo Ren, said not to panic because this was the ascension site of their old ancestor. Another cultivator, Qin Hong Zhenren, also spoke up. "That's right, why don't you look for the reasons within yourself? Have you been seriously cultivating? Haven't you been in the bottleneck stage for many years now?" An angry Hezui said that he had closed himself in meditation 2.5 years ago, and the saint kept trying to reconcile them. But the two men continued to mock the younger brother, causing him to flare up with anger. Suddenly, someone called the teacher. They came to report about the situation with the new students. The sect leader patted Hezui on the shoulder and said, "Let's hear about the new disciples first, and then we'll talk." A guy in a long gray robe entered the room. The young man was very handsome and bowed and reported, "Li Changming, the outstanding one, the most handsome in Taishuan, presents himself to the teachers." However, the elders did not want to listen to his praise. The embarrassed young man cleared his throat, getting ready to continue the conversation. Unfolding the parchment, he began to list that this time he accepted 180 disciples, 100 of whom had a low spiritual level. The elder from Gifen was delighted that all the strong children were from his area, and another cultivator congratulated him. Lichen also said, 72 people with average spiritual roots, and Zhenren gloated, because they surpassed last year's figures in Zhangfen, and in the town of Hezui, there was no one at all. The cultivator was furious at this suggestion. He instantly grabbed the sword, intending to draw it. Lightning flashed. The man's aura forced the cultivators to retreat. Hezui was about to raise Shaoqi town to the ground. Meanwhile, the guy continued to talk, provoking the elder even more, about the super high level of 1 person and the high level of 7. But the next word, Shaoqi, caused the cultivator to break abruptly. He turned around, not believing what he heard. Hezui happily asked again if the high spiritual root was really from Shaoqi. Having rolled up the scroll, the young man congratulated his older brother on receiving talented students. The other cultivators didn't believe that such a thing was possible. How could so many talents suddenly appear from a small town when there had only been a single disciple with a middle root in the last 300 years? Of course, Hezui angrily exclaimed, "Is that so? Then only you can have disciples with high spiritual roots?" And the others began to ask the Lord to double-check everything. Only Chang Xuan stopped them when he saw something. He had a list of names in his hands, and the elders looked at it as the leader explained. The new students were previously called porridge and dogs, but after training their names were changed. They looked with surprise at the prominent names of each child. The most striking was Wei Zhongxiang, who had a Confucian spirit about him, and the cultivators thought that one of the religious teachers was teaching them. All the names were different. Some were refined, others were masculine or religious. Now the men were sure that the man who inspired the students was certainly an outstanding master of Confucianism and Taoism. Throwing up the list of names, Hezui was sure that this was a blessing from the gods. But Zhenren realized that his elder brother was silent, which meant he must have felt something unusual, and Changshuan confirmed it. He was worried about how he had raised so many talents in a small town in just a few years, and the man thought about it for a long time. And I came to the only conclusion it could only be the progenitor. Maybe he returned to Shiochi and blessed these children. Hezui was happy and laughed and shouted that he was saved. But his brother still had doubts and wanted to see the results of the heavenly ladder test. The master agreed with him. This is a true test to check the student's qualifications. Even the possessor of a great gift needed 7 hours to reach the top. Changmin beamed as he corrected them. finishing in 6 hours and 3/4. Genren argued that if Hezui's disciples couldn't even touch the ladder, they would be useless, but he was sure that they were just jealous of him. And then someone appeared at the door with a message. The elders went outside where the senior disciple Lu Wu Shuang appeared before them. She bowed to the respected teachers, introducing 7 new students who were completely calm, and one was even picking his nose. The head of the sect came forward, scolding the girl for interfering with the test. However, she kept her head down and did not dare to break the rules. And she said, "I just came here and found that these new students had already passed the ladder test and were waiting here." The teachers were shocked by this news and froze in place. A little time passed and the already dressed children bowed before the teachers, saying their names. Hezui even shed tears from such good manners. The elder called the first child, Chun Feng, and the boy approached him. Chang Xuan extended his hand and placed it on the disciple's head, intending to probe his spiritual roots. And then a bright blue aura flared up around. The master was stunned, because it was the embryo of a soul that was fed only by ancestral roots. Xuan, who was observing all this, became interested in what the innate energy rhythm and subsequent spiritual roots are. The head of the sect told the girl that when a student reaches the highest level in his practice, he can interact with the Great Path and cause energetic radiance. And the subsequent spiritual roots are extreme. And they only arise when from an early age the student receives an innate energetic influence. The man finished. He recalled how, 1,000 years ago, the saints had united to create a place of innate energetic influence, but it had ended in failure. And so it was amazing to find these energy fields in a small town and 7 at once. The cultivators thought about how strong the man in Jeochi was and how great it would be to see him. But he probably didn't think their holy land was important since he didn't come to them. And Xuan was also amazed by the power of her predecessor, who turned out to be a creature that even the holy head fears. Chang Xuan ordered his brother to take the girl with him and take the children to Mount Linjiang, and Hezui agreed with a smile. Turning around, he abruptly waved his hand, intending to leave. The man called the children to come with him and walked forward with a confident gait. After a short journey, they finally arrived at Mount Linjiang. The elder immediately began to drink tea. "You're glowing. The visit to that town was a success, wasn't it?" he said to the girl, handing him the cup. He began to drink, and Xuan, with a bow, assured him that she did not dare deceive the teacher. And then she shocked the teacher by confessing, "I have already reached the 7th level in the Golden Sword Scroll." Hezui couldn't understand how she had advanced so quickly. Grabbing the student by the shoulders, he asked what had happened. The confused girl tried to calm the master down so that he would listen to her. The man moved away, cleared his throat, and came to his senses. He turned around to check with Shuang if she really met that great man in the small town. Wiping away the sweat, the student admitted that she had indeed accidentally stumbled upon his hiding place. She pulled out a rolled-up parchment from her sleeve and said, "We also received one of the master's works." The elder turned around in interest as the girl handed over the parchment and added that this image of the master had served as an inspiration to her. Deciding to take a look at it, he took the drawing from Xuan's hands. Slowly, Hezui began to unfold the powerful portrait. The man had to turn away from the bright light of his aura, covering his eyes. When he finally got a good look at the drawing, he just opened his mouth in amazement. And in Xiaoqi, all was calm. Master Ye continued his game of Go, while Princess Yang watched him. She watched with great admiration as the boy elegantly moved the pieces. However, Changqing was distracted by this constant gaze and asked why the girl was looking at him. She beamed and replied that everything was fine and that she was just curious. And the guy couldn't understand how she changed so quickly because she just looked at the chessboard. Every day, Yang began to address him respectfully and woke up even earlier than Mr. Ye, admiring his activity. "I swept the yard, although the foreman said it was not necessary. She helped a lot in the store and hardly rested, insisting that she was not tired." Looking at how skillfully the girl poured tea, Changqing wondered if she really wanted to buy his painting at a lower price. Smiling and beaming, the princess offered him the drink, and her happy face gave the guy an idea. Perhaps she is attracted by his attractive appearance. The embarrassed Mr. Ye couldn't ignore the beauty's attention. Calmly rearranging the pieces, he turned to Yang. Smiling, he offered to go grocery shopping together, as he was planning to cook a special dish today. The central street of the small village was crowded. Everyone around greeted Changqing and he waved back with a smile. The guy stopped at the counter and the girl was amazed by his respect and veneration among the locals. He started arguing with the saleswoman over expensive vegetables. But the princess only admired the master's modesty and friendliness even more. Next, they went to the butcher's shop, where they happily asked him what Mr. E would buy today. He asked for 2 pounds of the best pork side, and the seller began to cut up what he needed. When everything was ready, he tied the meat beautifully, tightening the bow. While handing over the goods, the man asked, "Have you brought your wife with you today?" The embarrassed girl blushed, realizing that they were talking about her. But Changqing corrected the salesman. "You are mistaken, Lady Yang is my guest." The man added in a whisper, "My neighbor told me that there was a lot of fuss in your house a couple of days ago. Take care of your health." And the guy, knowing that the princess would soon return to the capital, justified the residence so that she would not be offended. But the girl did not even pay attention to this. Irritated, Mr. Ye hoped that she would leave soon, because his hut was not able to support anyone else. And Yang, giggling, was already trying on the word wife. And somewhere on another street a strange group was walking, from which all the people ran away. They looked like bandits, with pointed ears, fangs, and upturned noses. One of them sniffed, drawing in the air through his nose. And he said, "Boss, I felt the breath of the Black Emperor right in this store." Their leader was especially pig-like, intending to bring this Black Emperor back and please the Fire King. The robbers laughed, rejoicing that the Emperor had received serious wounds and had returned to his original state. Approaching the shop, they kicked down the door. Right at the threshold, they were met by a black dog, and the bandits shouted at him to get out of there. "Today you will die, and you will have no peace," the leader cried furiously. The dog was calm. "Stupid pig, did you really dare to follow me?" However, they were confident that the Emperor now meant nothing, and they got down to business, preparing to attack. And suddenly, a golden aura flared up around the dog, turning into a huge monster, and he said, "On the master's land, even the red fire means nothing. I didn't intend to commit murder, but you crossed the line." From the store came plaintive cries. "What's going on, brother? Save me, my demon pearl is broken." But in the holy land of Taishuan, everything was calm. The sect leader spoke to Changming. "You are a disciple with a high chance of becoming the next saint ruler. What do you think of such a powerful figure appearing in Xiaoqi?" The young man replied, "It seems he is not hostile to our land. I think he just happened to be there." The elder was confident that if this was the case, then the sacred land of Taishuan would definitely prosper. The door to the room swung open with a loud bang. Calling the elder, a joyful Hezui entered, followed by his student. The master's behavior confused her a little, and she sighed heavily. Turning around, Saint Guifeng was surprised. Didn't he leave with the new disciples? But suddenly he noticed something surprising in the younger one. This man achieved a breakthrough in such a short time. The astonished elder asked, "You have been stuck at the same level for 2,000 years, why now?" But Hezui didn't care about the breakthrough, and he unfolded the picture in front of the leader. At first, the old man did not understand what was so special about her. Looking more closely, her true strength was revealed to him. There was a tremendous amount of energy contained in this portrait, and it was bursting out. It seemed that the spirit of the heavenly ruler himself was hidden there, and thousands of his spiritual swords come out from there. Looking straight into the golden glow of Changshuan's aura, he was blinded. Many transparent swords attacked the elder, and he didn't know what was happening. It was as if an abyss had opened above them, subordinate to a higher being from which golden blades flew endlessly. The two younger students standing nearby also couldn't withstand the pressure of this force. Shuang cried out in panic, "Supreme! Close the scroll first!" Finally, having folded his palms into a seal, the old man managed to roll up the parchment. Shocked, he breathed heavily, trying to come to his senses. While the elder was clutching the painting tightly in his fist, everyone noticed that the light from it was gradually beginning to fade. Everyone looked around the room in surprise, as it turned out to be studded with transparent swords. Thousands of blades were stuck into the doors, floor, and ceiling. Exhaling, the head admitted that it seemed like everything was over, and the swords really did slowly begin to disappear. Saint Guifeng approached Hezui and clapped him on the shoulder. And with delight, the Supreme One wondered where the student got this picture with such a high understanding of the sword. In response, Hezui asked to be allowed to tell Lu Wushuang about this. Bowing before the Supreme Elder, she confessed, this painting was given to her by a tall man from Xiaoqi. She also added that he allowed her to turn to him for advice at any time. A stunned Changming asked the girl again if all this was really true. She calmly replied that she had never lied, and even her accompanying sister Wang could confirm this. This made Changshuan laugh out loud. The cultivators looked at the Lord in surprise, wondering why he suddenly laughed. Little by little, the old man, who had become more cheerful, began to calm down and the laughter died down. However, he immediately exclaimed, "We are really lucky in Taishuan, aren't we?" Smiling, Saint Guifeng asked the disciple Li, "So, your elder received the teaching only from a painting, and yet this master allowed her to turn to him for any question. Does she know what this means? But the girl did not know the answer to this question and asked for an explanation. And Changshuan said, "This means that the person you met is most likely the ancestor of our school, and it also means that he has no plans to leave Shaoqi for now." Beaming with happiness, the ruler was confident that they would now rise to new heights. Pointing to Shuang, he appointed her as the holy priestess of the sacred land of Taishuan, standing next to the holy sun. The girl was both confused and delighted by the new status. But the young man was not at all happy and only exclaimed in shock. Meanwhile, the city was, as always, crowded and noisy. Someone spread gossip about Sister Li of Mount Linjing being appointed as a saint, and people thought that this decision was hasty. The girls were walking down the street, and junior student Wang overheard this conversation. As they walked further, they heard more voices. The cultivators were aware that Li Changming had been appointed as the saint's successor, but now the situation had changed. Given his pride, it might cause discontent. Wang thought that the saint wanted Shuang to take Li Changming's place as the heir, but the girl said, "Although I have natural talent in the field of ascension, I only have a single attribute and do not originally have the qualification of a saint." She thought that this time the saint was probably guided by the promise given to her by the elder Yi. The younger sister was surprised that even a saint thought that this handsome shop owner was so strong. Shuang had an idea. If she contacted Elder Ye a few more times, then she would definitely gain powerful strength, and thus she will become a real saint. But Changmin was sad. His face became pale and there were bags under his eyes. Sitting under the tree, he cried, not understanding why the teacher decided to choose his younger sister as a saint. The guy was shaking all over and shedding tears when one of the local girls noticed him. Sitting down next to him, she began to console the young man. "Don't worry. This time Shuang went to Xiaoqi to recruit a few more disciples. She must have just been lucky." And then the boy realized that all this must have happened when Sister Wu met her ancestor in the city. To the girl's surprise, Changmin jumped to his feet with an angry face. Shrouded in a strong aura, he raised his hand, and he called upon his sword, which immediately appeared at his call in blue flashes. The strong wind and electricity coming from the blade made the young student turn away. Jumping onto the sword, the young man flew forward. He was sure that with his double roots and attributes, his ancestor would definitely appreciate him more. Changming thought with a smile that if the elder helped him and taught him, then Sister Shuang would no longer be a threat. He quickly rode away on his sword, intending to reach Xiaoqi City. Changqing and Princess Yang were walking there peacefully, and then the guy decided to find out why the girl ended up in his bed that night. Embarrassed, she replied that she didn't know, but she added, "I just felt itchy when I woke up." And when Yan opened her eyes, she saw Mr. Yi touching her. Feeling ashamed, Changqing tried to justify himself because he had done nothing. However, his outstretched hand was suddenly grabbed. Squeezing it in her palms, the princess said, "I understand that the master is not such a person and is not interested in such dirty things." The girl was beaming with happiness and was sure that their meeting was an order from heaven. The confused guy thought she had misunderstood something. After all, he was not a celestial being and he was interested in all these dirty things. But suddenly, a tear ran down his cheek and his lips curled. Changqing was terribly sorry that he did not have enough strength and was simply afraid to take on the matter. And then his gaze fell on something unusual. It was a strange young man who walked on tiptoe down the street as if trying to hide. The alarmed boy couldn't believe that this was possible. In his panic, he couldn't believe that there were such monsters in this town. Just a quarter of an hour ago, Changming was flying towards the small town of Xiaoqi. There in the mountains, a strange energy flow was felt, and the cultivator remembered what his teacher had told him about it. As he approached quickly, he felt this stream under a small pond in the village. The energy led him to a small shop. Having flown up to her, the guy stopped with his foot on the ground. In this place, the energy flow was the densest. He noticed a sign above the doors, and when he read it carefully, he realized that it was not at all ordinary. He cried out in shock as the power enveloped him. From there, a sharp sword flew towards Changmin. He passed through the young man's chest like a golden arrow. Sweat was running down his face. Even if the guy had not trained in sword art, he could still feel the enormous power contained in this place, and he realized that this was probably where Shuang got her chance. He sighed, hit his fist against his palm, and bowed, greeting the elder. "Tai Xuan, the inheritor of the sacred world, Li Changming. I ask you to grant a meeting with the ancestor." But no one heard his high-flown words, and there was silence all around. Raising his head, the cultivator saw that the door to the shop was open and immediately wondered if the ancestor had left. And he went inside, although he thought that it was not good to break into the ancestral home like that. But Changmin left the house without the teacher's knowledge, and he didn't have much time. This time, the guy really wanted to achieve something. With this attitude, he confidently stepped inside. Seeing someone inside, he immediately introduced himself as a disciple from the Holy Land. There, in the center of incredible energy and dead bodies, sat a strange creature with black fur and a tail. When it turned around, the dog's eyes flashed scarlet. The monster stood on its hind legs and incredible power emanated from it. The young man opened his eyes in horror, not expecting to see something like this here. Unable to stay on his feet, he sat down on the floor, hitting his tailbone. After all, he trembled and didn't know how a demon lord-level beast appeared in this village. But suddenly someone's hand fell on Changmin's shoulder. He turned around and screamed, because it seemed to him that there was a monster standing there too. However, the next moment, a smile blossomed on the face of the man who appeared and he asked, "It seems you were scared. Is everything okay?" Stuttering and shaking with fear, the boy pointed inside the store, claiming that he saw something there. Mr. Ye wondered what could be in his shop. In shock, the young man asked again if this was really this man's store. Having put down the basket of vegetables, the guy stood up, confirming that this was indeed the case. While he was talking with the guest, Princess Yang was already approaching them. Despite Changmin's warnings, the boy went to see if there was anything strange inside. Opening the door, he looked back, calling the Black Emperor. But then Mr. E noticed something unusual. There were many wild boar bodies scattered around the shop. And suddenly an idea came into the guy's head about how this happened. He gave Miss Yang a basket of groceries. Then turning to the frightened young man, Changqing began to explain, thinking that the young man had misunderstood. The stunned cultivator wondered what they could have told him. And the shop owner said, "Although I sometimes collect mountain goods to sell, I have never collected mountain boars." But the guy looked at him with a completely uncomprehending look. He wondered what this man meant, and he decided that this gentleman probably wanted Changmin to help him remove the demonic bodies. Suddenly, the Black Emperor interrupted Changqing with his barking. Seeing the dog, the young man froze in horror, his eyes wide open. In an instant, he jumped back to the very exit. Pointing his finger at the dog, the guy shouted, "It's him!" However, Mr. Yes smiled brightly and grabbed the dog by the scruff of the neck, saying, "This is my pet. He's a little stupid. Don't be offended." And in the eyes of the young man, this dog with a strong aura was a bloodthirsty monster. He was truly horrified that someone would keep the Demon King as a pet. Taking a long breath and calming down, the guy thought that this could be the one he was looking for. Changmin bowed deeply and introduced himself again, greeting the elder and saying that he had come for guidance. Listening to all this, Changqing only looked at the guest with bewilderment. With excitement, he realized that as soon as he was called a senior, it meant that something was not right, and that this was again a person from the Holy Land of Taishuan. Last time a girl showed up and took the painting for 3 coppers. This time they angered the guy even more by leaving wild pigs in exchange. He thought angrily, "Were all cultivators so greedy?" Standing in front of the shaking youth, Mr. Ye finally calmed down, deciding that the wild pigs were quite plump, and if he sold them to a butcher, he could get 8 liang. And Changmin was in a panic, trying to understand why the ancestor didn't speak. Did he really disturb his peace? He was overcome with a mad fear that he had angered his elder. Only this elder was now busy counting the boars and how much he could get from them. It came to 13 liang, and the guy even lit up in anticipation of a big profit. Approaching the very sad young man, Changqing patted him on the shoulder, and to his surprise, he agreed to mentor the young man. Smiling, Mr. Ye thought that it seemed like there were intelligent people in the immortal world. He asked happily, "Have you also come for a painting or calligraphy?" At first, Changmin couldn't figure out what other painting he was being offered. But then he remembered that his elder sister Shuang had shown the master a sacred relic. He jumped up abruptly and grabbed the shop owner by the hand. Tears streamed down the young man's cheeks as he replied to the stunned Changqing, "You're right, that's why I'm here." Mr. Ye waved his free hand and invited the boy inside. He was going to get a little more serious since they were giving him so many boars. Changmin thought that this senior was surprisingly so cute. Taking his chin, the guy thought that he already recognized him. Such a wonderful man. Meanwhile, Changming imagined how they ran and jumped under the setting sun of the sacred land of Taishuan. Looking up from his letter, he asked the boy if there was a word he wanted to see on the canvas, and he began to throw out options. Changming just laughed quietly, looking somewhere to the side, and Changqing wondered what he was looking at. The Black Emperor thought that he was afraid that he might notice him, but it seems that he is not very smart. Having bitten the guy on the hand, he mentally told himself not to be rude in front of the owner and to sober up. Changmin, who hadn't expected this, awkwardly stepped back while the dog's jaws were on his hand. Hearing the strange sounds, Chongqing turned around and asked him what was wrong with him. The Black Emperor was already sitting quietly next to the guy, and he awkwardly said that they were just playing. Taking up his brush, Chongqing exclaimed that he would then make a laughingstock of him. At that moment, Yingxing entered the room, announcing that the material was ready. But then she noticed that it was not the eldest who wanted to write hieroglyphs. She immediately rushed to the table and offered to help him rub the ink. Chongqing didn't ask her, but simply accepted her help. Coming closer, the girl pushed Changmin away. As she rubbed the ink, she thought about how she used to be completely immersed in a game of chess when she watched it. If it is calligraphy, then who knows what endless truths and laws it will contain. As he loaded his brush with ink, Chongqing said to himself that at that moment the pen was 1 centimeter away from his paper. He began to move his brush across the paper, thinking that in a quarter of an hour everything would change. Anyone who sees this inscription will be absolutely enchanted by it. Yingxing noticed that the gentleman was completely immersed in his thoughts while waiting, and Changming thought that this might be his only chance. And the movements of the brush continued, and it seemed as if the painting had gone beyond the boundaries of the canvas. Noticing that he was surrounded by the sight of the painting, Changmin's mouth dropped open in surprise. A second later, he and Yingxing were in a painting. Cranes were flying in the sky. Looking at the sky, Yingxing said that when the elder wrote vigorously, his aura seemed to transport one to the scene. Standing on one of the mountains, Changmin noticed that he could feel it. Tears welled up in his eyes and he said that he could feel true intention and purity in Senior Ye's movements. Suddenly, a green flame began to glow around him, and he exclaimed that it was the rhythm of the sword. And the next moment, the hieroglyphs entered his head in a stormy stream and shone in the sky. Changqing put down his brush after finishing the painting. After stretching his shoulder, he noticed that he had done well. Hearing some strange sounds from the side, he turned around to look at their source. It turned out that it was Yingxing and Changming who were shaking and making strange sounds. Moving behind their backs, Changqing placed his hands on their shoulders, bringing them back to consciousness. Looking at the guy, he said that he had already had 2 or 3 attacks today, and if he was sick, then he needed treatment. Changmin then folded his hands together and bowed to the elder, telling him that he had achieved the highest level of skill, and that he too had learned a lot. Chongqing replied that these were all trivial skills unworthy of attention, and he himself thought that finally there was someone who understood. Approaching the table, he began to roll up the canvas, and then he handed it to the guy. Changmin extended his hands to receive it and thanked the elder. And then the guy asked him to name the inscription. Chongqing thought for a moment and said that it was created as a token of gratitude for his generous gift. It immediately struck him and he exclaimed that it would be called generous gratitude. Changmin thought that generous meant generosity and the ability to accept everything, and gratitude symbolized mutual respect. It dawned on the boy, and he thought that the elder was truly a great master, capable of ascending to the higher world, since he was able to say such profound words. He thought that he was following the path of longevity, and that this inscription contained the highest harmony of the sword. Suddenly he realized that perhaps the teacher was hinting to him that all his previous training had been wrong. It's no wonder then that his skill hasn't progressed all these years. It seems his true goal must be related to the art of the sword. Changqing waved his hand and said that he couldn't help him any further and that he should deal with it himself when he returned. Changmin thought excitedly that the teacher was hinting to him that he should understand himself and choose a path. Following this, Changming, sobbing, flew out of the room in his place, exclaiming that giving up the path of longevity meant giving up the title of a holy son. He needed to think about it. Looking after him, Chongqing quietly asked what he had said. Not understanding anything, he said that he simply told the guy to do the paperwork himself. Meanwhile, Chaixuan was calmly drinking tea. Suddenly, Changmin burst in on him, jumping off his sword. He fell on his knees before his teacher, exclaiming that he realized that he had been wrong all these years. He asked the teacher if he noticed that he could not cope with the role of the holy son. Changshuan shed a tear as he thought about how he had always been raised as a future holy son. Now suddenly the Holy Virgin has appeared. It must be very difficult for him. Changshuan, without saying anything, only walked closer to his disciple. He moved down and grabbed the guy by the shoulders. The man told him not to be discouraged. Up until that moment, he had not hidden anything from him. Changmin waved his hand and said that he didn't mean it that way. Changshuan stood up and said that he didn't know. But the senior mentor who lived in Xiaoqi village had a great interest in the peerless blue eye socket and was willing to support her at any time. Changmin waved his hands in an attempt to get the teacher's attention, and the teacher continued to talk about how difficult it was for him to make this decision. The man said that he hoped he understood, and Changmin shuddered at his tone. The man turned around and put his hands on his shoulders again, saying that he was guided by wise aspirations. The The boy in response exclaimed that he understood everything, but he needed to speak out. With a sigh, the teacher told him to speak. Changmin beamed and said that he had actually met this senior earlier today. Suddenly, a tense silence filled the room, and Chang Shuyan froze. He hit the guy on the head with his fist, exclaiming that he was a fool. Changmin grabbed his bruised cheek and asked the teacher why he was hitting him. Cold sweat ran down the man's face as he said that since the ancestor had gone into seclusion, he clearly did not wish to be disturbed. He exclaimed that he had been rash in going where he was, and that he might have angered him, which would have led to trouble for the whole clan. Changmin responded by exclaiming that the elder had not shown any emotion, but on the contrary, had given him a painting, and he had reached into his sleeve to get it. Chang Xuan turned around abruptly, ordering his disciple to show him the painting, his eyes wide open. Chang Ming, with tears in his eyes, handed the painting to the teacher, saying that in this painting the ancestor was giving them a hint. He felt that his path of practice had changed. Chang Xuan began to examine the painting without daring to touch it, and he thought that it was too modest for a peerless painting. He thought that the rise and fall clearly indicated that the ancestor was pretending to care, and the boy fell for it. He asked the guy if he was really so stupid as to believe all this. Is he really so stupid as to believe that he can and should follow the highest path of practice, the path to eternal life? Changmin wanted to object, but the teacher immediately stopped him. Taking the painting from his hands, he said that the ancestor would give him an incomparable painting that contained the essence of her practice. Opening the scroll, he said that this painting was nothing more than just a piece of paper. While examining the painting, he told the student that his ancestor had clearly deceived him. But suddenly, a bright light poured from the painting straight into Chang Shuyan's face. Energy burst out of the painting, immersing the man in its world, and hieroglyphs were clearly imprinted on his head. Tears began to flow from the man's eyes. He thought that the ancestor was indeed a great person. He transferred the true meaning of the practice onto paper so that Changming might not fully understand. His body was shaking. His eyes were wide open. He thought that the peerless and the old man's friends had also reached a high level, but it was nothing compared to what the ancestor had given to Changmin. Turning to look at the student who stood sadly behind him, he wondered if he was really more suitable for practicing the Tao. Chang Xuan was lost in thought for a moment. Changming tried to call out to his teacher. He had to call out to him several times. The man turned to his student, who asked him what had happened. With shaking hands, the man grasped his student's palm. Tears welled up in his eyes again, and he said that he had just misunderstood everything. The elder had hinted to him that his achievements in the path of the Tao were higher than those of the incomparable. Changmin tried to say that he understood what the teacher meant, but he was interrupted. Chang Xuan said that as the main figures of Mount Taishuan, they could not ignore the words of the elder. From this day on, he must use the saying, "Even and odd do not change." Symbols look at the quadrant as the basis for his practice and change himself by following the way of the Tao. The man told the student to go, and he bowed politely, saying that he obeyed. Pushing off the floor, Changmin once again flew up into the sky on his sword. Chang Xuan stood at the door, watching the boy leave. As he went outside, he told his student with tears in his eyes to always remember the great hopes he had for him. Already flying high in the sky, Changmin replied that he understood everything. After some time, Hezui, Mo Ren, and Zhenren came to Chang Xuan. Zhenren asked the head teacher why he was in such a hurry to gather them all here. Chang Xuan sat on the sofa, bursting into tears, and he could barely mutter that his only disciple, his only inheritor of the path of immortality, Tai Xuan, had lost his way. Not understanding anything, Zhenren asked him what happened, to which Mo Ren replied that he did not understand, and Hezui said that perhaps he had failed in his practice last night. Finally, Chang Xuan stopped crying and stood up from the sofa, coughing awkwardly. In his usual elevated tone, he told them all to calm down, and then he said that today he had two things that he would like to discuss with them. He said that firstly, a few days ago he already said that he wanted to appoint the peerless holy maiden Taishuan, but it was not in order to infringe on anyone. The goal is to strengthen the bond with that elder from Xiaoji village. Secondly, in a month the 10-year tournament between Taishuan and Zining will begin. The young masters of Zining will arrive with their leader Shu Jitian to fight them at Mount Taishuyan. At this time, everyone should carefully supervise their students and encourage them to practice diligently and not allow them to be lazy. Zhenren noted that in previous years, the head teacher and their students had performed in this tournament with varying success. But in the chess games between him and Shu Jitian, he had never won against her before. These words wounded Xuan to the very heart. Hetsui decided to tease him too, saying that it seemed like the head teacher was the laziest student here. The others noticed that every time he lost, He lost at least one medium valuable relic and a 1,000-year herb. How much longer could he bear these losses? Perhaps he should not feel in this tournament anymore, for the sake of saving. Angry and embarrassed, Chang Xuan shouted, asking what kind of savings they were talking about. He doesn't play for relics and herbs. Raising his finger in the air, he said that he simply thought that Shu Jitian's 4 dragons releasing water strategy was very complex and multifaceted, and so he would like to fight him a few more times. Stroking his long beard, he pompously remarked that they simply did not understand anything, and he himself thought that he could not figure it out. It was impossible. Hezui walked closer to the head teacher and asked him if the elder from Xiaoji village might know a way to solve it. When Chang Xuan became interested, the man told him not to even dream about it. This elder has been living in this world for several thousand years. His skill is beyond their understanding. What seems difficult to them is just a trifle for him. Chang Xuan was struck by these words and exclaimed that this was simply wonderful. Clearing his throat awkwardly, he corrected himself by saying that what the student had said made sense. And then he said that, having reached the level of this senior, the main focus is on the development of the spirit, and chess is one of the best ways to do this. And he himself thought that he should take advantage of this opportunity and go to the elder to ask him to teach him a few techniques. The next day, Shuang stood somewhere near the cliff, meditating, bright flashes of energy flying around her body. She practiced with the sword, swinging it in different directions and thus honing her techniques. Having approached the tree, she cut the tree trunk without much difficulty. With a sigh, she landed on the ground and sheathed her sword. Suddenly, there was a clapping sound from behind her. Hearing this sound, Shuang immediately turned around, thinking that she didn't even notice that there was someone behind her. As it turned out, it was Chang Xuan. He told the girl that it was incredible. He didn't expect that she had already mastered the 7th level of the Golden Dao so well. Shuang told him not to overestimate her, because it was all thanks to his instructions. Stroking his beard, he said that he and the elders had decided to hold the official Holy Maiden initiation ceremony immediately after the conclusion of the Taishuan and Xening tournament. With her hands folded in a polite gesture, Shuang said that as a student, she completely obeyed the head teacher's decision. Following this, the man turned around, leaving the girl looking at him in confusion. Suddenly, he asked her about the character of the elder who lived in Xiaoji village. Shuang replied that this elder had an incredibly high level of skill, but in dealing with people, he was still very humble, polite, and friendly. Chang Xuan laughed and remarked that she was still young and would not accept the true meaning of high achievements. Apparently, the elder had noticed her abilities and therefore treated her with sympathy. Blushing, Xuan asked the man again whether the elder man really liked her. Chang Xuan said that he had already prepared generous gifts and intended to go to Xiaoji village to visit the elder. He told Shuang that he wanted the tables just in case she was with him as an intermediary. Shuang was happy about this and thought that she didn't expect that they would meet again so soon. Chang Xuan told the girl not to call him teacher in front of her elder, so that he would violate the hierarchy, but simply so that she would consider him as an elder relative. Shuang bowed respectfully again. Meanwhile, Changqing was sitting at the table in the courtyard. He clenched his hand in annoyance as Yingxing noticed the ground next to him. However, she did it so ineptly that all the dust flew straight at Changqing. Unable to bear it any longer, Changqing turned to her and told the girl to go and rest. Yingxing exclaimed that she was not tired at all. Changqing reached out and grabbed the broom in her hands. Tearing her out of the girl's arms, he, trying to keep a smile on his face, told her to go and rest. Yingxing thought that the elder was so kind to her, and her heart began to beat faster. Turning around, she went into the house, saying that she would then prepare dinner. Even more frightened, Changqing exclaimed for her to just sit somewhere. This time, Yingxing did not resist and replied that she would do so. Changqing made a dissatisfied face and thought that she, like a real princess, did nothing, but cooked dinner first. However, unfortunately, he cannot get angry with her. Even if he is angry, he can only smile. An irritated Changqing slammed his brush on the table, causing drops of ink to fly everywhere. He thought that it would be good if she was already about to leave, because even the landowners did not have so many resources. Meanwhile, a group of people appeared at the entrance to the village. The girl waved the amulet at her master, saying that the amulet showed that the 9th princess was somewhere in this village. Then in response to this gentleman went forward, commanding the others to follow him. Entering the village, they passed through a barrier that they did not notice. Suddenly, that same girl looked at the amulet again and her eyebrows rose in surprise. She noticed that the amulet suddenly stopped glowing. The man said that Xiaoji village used to be the holy place of Taishuan, so there must be some restrictions in place. And he thought that he felt that there was a lot of great Tao energy around. But then one of the guys told him that as far as he remembered, the spiritual energy of this village had been depleted for hundreds of years, so why wasn't there so much here? The man replied that he didn't know either. But they didn't have time for that now. The ninth princess had been missing for more than 2 weeks. They needed to find her. He sternly said that this was their main task. Otherwise, they would face severe punishment. Following this, he took a deep breath, inhaling the Tao energy from the air. He clasped his palms together, tensed up, and streams of energy poured out of his body. He began to spread his arms to the sides, and a small ball of energy began to shine between them. And then some golden energy became visible in the air, leading its flow somewhere. The man ran forward, saying that this source of spiritual energy could be useful. As it turned out, this energy trail led them to some house. The man stopped, noticing that this house was the source of energy in the village. He stepped forward, motioning for his subordinates to explore the area. But suddenly something quickly flew right into the place where the man was standing, but he managed to jump away. As he landed on the ground, he noticed 2 people walking towards them. Changsen noticed that the person in front of him must be Liu Changhe, the head of the palace guards of the imperial family of the Yan state. Changhe stood up and bowed to the man, saying that it was unexpected to meet the Supreme Master Taishuan here. Suen said that their presence in Taishuan lands today violates the non-aggression treaty. Changhe immediately exclaimed that they didn't want to break the treaty, but they had to come here to find the missing 9th princess. Changshuan didn't believe it and shouted in annoyance, asking them how their princess could end up in such a place. But suddenly, someone called out to Liu Changhe, and everyone immediately turned around. As it turned out, Yingjing came out of the house door. Still holding the broom, she asked the man why he was there. Changhe asked the princess why she was dressed like that. And Changshuan asked the man if he was sure that this was the same princess. Changhe shouted in anger, asking who dared to keep the princess here and force her to do rough work. Stroking his beard, Changshuan guessed that it might be the same senior who was in charge here, and Shuang blushed, thinking that the senior might have some special preferences. Changhe grabbed the princess by the hand and pulled her forward, saying that this was Taishuan territory. First they needed to get out of here, and then he would send people to capture this villain and punish him to the fullest extent. Changshuan became angry, thinking that they dared to disrespect their elder, and if it weren't for the respect for the emperor of the Yan state, he would have punished them already. But suddenly, Yingxing pulled her hand out of the man's grip. She remained standing behind him, and Changhe asked her what was the matter. Instead of answering, the girl hit the man in the face with her hand. She shouted irritably at them to shut up. Everyone looked at the girl in surprise, not expecting such an outcome at all. Raising her broom, she shouted that with such impudent words he wanted to destroy the 1,000-year fate of their Yan state. Changhe replied that they had the protection of the emperor and their ancestors in the state of Yan, and she was not yet experienced enough, and she would be deceived by some unknown hermit. Changshuan responded by asking him how he dared to speak like that, and whether he knew who lived in this humble house. Changhe asked irritably if this was really one of Taishuan's elders. And while irritated cries were heard outside, the Black Emperor was sleeping on the floor in one of the rooms. He too was starting to get irritated, thinking that they should stop shouting like that. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he rose from the floor and stretched. Finally waking up, he walked to the doorway to go out to the annoying guests. And suddenly the paw that was behind the threshold began to glow red. The Black Emperor came out, a large copy of himself glowing behind him, and he barked threateningly. Changhe was seriously scared when he noticed that the Demon King was standing in front of them. As the Black Emperor came closer and closer, the man asked what the Demon King was doing here, but in any case, he couldn't be allowed to harm anyone. The Black Emperor noticed that this old man also wanted to fight, and he thought that now they would find out his poison. The spiritual copy of the Black Emperor raised its head up, howling loudly. Changshen and Liu Changhe were gathering their energy, one to stop it and the other to strike. But suddenly, in the midst of this radiance, someone's fist appeared. It turned out that it was Changqing, who hit the dog on the head, asking the Black Emperor if he was misbehaving again. He exclaimed that a dog that bites people must be neutralized. The Black Emperor looked sadly at his master, and tears flowed from his eyes. Xuan and Chang'e both wondered who this person was that dared to order the Demon King. They didn't even feel any energy when he appeared. Changqing looked at the other people and apologized, saying that he was the owner of this shop and this was his pet. These words surprised the men even more, because they did not expect that the Demon King could also be a pet. Xuan hurried to bow and greet her elder. Changqing noticed that they hadn't seen each other for several days, and he asked her what brought her here today. Pointing to Chang Xuan, the girl replied that this was a man from her family. He saw the painting that she had bought from him earlier and was deeply impressed. so he came today especially to bow. Chang Xuan had no choice but to come closer and bow to Chang Qing, introducing himself to him. Chang Qing asked him to stand up immediately, and he himself, taking out a fan to hide his smile, thought that although he had no spiritual roots, his skill in painting was excellent, so he was worthy of being called elder by such a noble elder. Looking at Ying Xing, Chang Qing asked her who the person next to her was. Chang He was about to introduce himself, calling himself an old servant of the Emperor of the Yan State. But the girl interrupted him, saying that his name was Old Chen, and he was the manager, and he came here to find her. Suddenly, to the girl's surprise, Chang Qing walked past her straight towards the man. He grabbed his hand and with tears in his eyes said that he had finally waited for him. Leaning towards him, Chang Qing whispered to the man whether he had come to pick up his mistress, to which he replied in the affirmative. Then Chang Qing went to his shop, telling them all to come in and have some tea. Chang Xuan immediately became happy and loudly thanked the elder. After passing through the shop, the guy led the guests into his yard. The girls walked through the doorway with ease and the men followed them. But suddenly, taking a step forward, they came across some kind of barrier and bumped into it with their faces. Chang Xuan asked if this was the legendary defensive barrier technique that created itself. Chang He said that only ancient artifacts could create a barrier of such strength. Chang Xuan said that Shuang and the 9th princess had low cultivation so they weren't pushed back by the barrier, while their levels were too high so they were delayed. Chang Qing turned to the men and asked them what was wrong and told them to come in quickly. And then, driven by the wind, a single leaf flew through the barrier. The leaf broke the barrier, causing Chang Xuan and Chang He to fall inside. They fell awkwardly and heavily on their faces on the ground, and Chang Qing asked them what was wrong with them. The men quickly raised their faces from the ground, their noses bleeding, and awkwardly replied that they were walking unsteadily. Chang Qing did not dwell on this any further and led the guests on. Suddenly the men froze again, stopped in their tracks, and opened their mouths wide in surprise. As it turned out, they noticed that inside this house there was a Demon King black dog, and next to him, in the form of an ordinary tree, was an ancient demon. They noticed that everything in this house was imbued with Tao and ritual energy. They exclaimed that it seemed like they had ended up in some incredible place. Chang Qing told his guests to sit down while he went to get some tea. The guests obeyed the host, and all four sat down at a round table. Chang He, startled, asked Chang Xuan what he thought this elder was. Chang Xuan also shuddered and replied that he knew this person was great, but he didn't expect his level to be so high. Looking at the ancient demon, Chang He said that usually such demons were only found in places with great dances and opportunities, and now he lived in this small courtyard. Clutching his chest, the man noticed that just sitting on this bench he could hardly breathe. Chang Xuan also placed his hand on his stomach and said that this was just a test for them. But suddenly he noticed something on the table that was standing nearby. Chang Xuan slammed his hands on the table and stood up with a jerk. He laughed and walked to another table and said that he had expected so. He smiled and happily noticed that Elder Yi was also studying chess. Ying Xing called out to him, telling him to be careful. However, he did not hear her, and so he came even closer, and suddenly the board lit up with a bright light. The man exclaimed that this chessboard wanted to teach him something. The board continued to glow, and its energy filled the entire space. And suddenly, in Chang Xuan's head, the words sounded, "The army has no permanent position. Water has no permanent form. The sun has its short and long days. The moon has its phases." Chang Xuan was moved by these lines. Tears flowed from his eyes and he exclaimed that he understood everything. Meanwhile, Chang Qing came out of the house with a tray in his hands, apologizing for keeping them waiting. And the guests all moved to the chess table, crowding around it, and Chang Qing asked them what had happened to them. Chang Xuan rushed towards the elder, asking him if he could find out what kind of chess game this was. Chang Qing didn't quite understand the question, so he asked again, but then replied that it was a draw. The unknown word startled the men, and they opened their mouths wide. Smiling, Chang Yi said that draw was a good name. Although it looks like a confrontation between black and white figures, it contains the path to peace, the path to the obstacle, the path to harmony and life. Chang Xuan beamed and exclaimed that opposition is balance. It is harmony. This game of chess is so deep that it is rare in this world. Chang Qing didn't understand what these old men were talking about. He thought that a draw was just a draw where no one won. What was there to analyze? He quickly changed the subject, saying that there was nothing special about his house, and then asked them to try his homemade tea, and Chang Xuan and Chang He gratefully accepted this as well. Chang Xuan thought that a legendary figure like Ye Changqing was making tea, which meant he had knowledge in this matter. Their clan just happens to have a tea cake made from insight leaves left by their ancestors. He might like it. The insight leaves are a sacred item for cultivation. Even if they are fragments, they are priceless, and it can bring him closer to the elder. Chang King placed a small box on the table from which strong energy emanated. Covering his eyes with his hand, Chang Xuan wondered what it was. And then, to everyone's surprise, Chang Qing used tweezers to take out a whole sheet of insight from the box. Chang Xuan and Chang He thought that this was the first time they had seen whole leaves. Could this luxurious style really be the master's style? Chang King began to brew tea, and Chang Xuan thought that when the insight leaves were first brewed, all the spiritual energy on the surface of the leaves would dissolve in the water. The men smelled a scent that was incredibly clean. But then, the guy poured the tea into a glass and poured it behind his back. Noticing the strange expressions on the men's faces, Chang Qing asked them what had happened. When they both pointed to the puddle behind him, the elder replied that it was just some washing tea. Nothing special, just to wash away dust. Having already thoroughly brewed the tea, he poured it into cups and placed them on the table. Taking the mugs in their hands, Chang Xuan and Chang He thought that they were a little scared to drink this tea. The girls thought that just by smelling the aroma, they already feel how their level rises. Chang King noticed the strange expressions on the faces of the guests as they looked at the cups. He thought that he had completely forgotten that these people were not simple cultivators. They usually only drank the best of the best, and his tea did not reach that level. Forcing a smile, he said that if they really thought it was hard to drink, they didn't have to drink it. Chang Xuan said in a panic that they were just enjoying the aroma of the tea. And finally, all the guests took their first sip, and immediately their bodies were filled with unbearable bliss. Their faces turned red with pleasure. Chang'e had already said out loud that this was such bliss, and then asked Chang Xuan about what he felt. Chang Xuan replied that it was undoubtedly the tea made from the leaves of insight. He said he already feels his level reaching new heights. Chang King couldn't help but be amazed by his guests, and he wondered why they were acting as if they had drunk the elixir of immortality. Meanwhile, Chang Xuan and Chang He felt some changes in their bodies. Mr. Liu noticed that his strength had returned, and the head mentor, clutching his head, said that he felt as if someone had returned to him the cultivation he had lost over the past 1,000 years. Chang King asked his guests how they liked his tea, which brought them back to reality. Chang Xuan leaned towards Chang He and asked him how they should answer, to which the latter suggested that it was a test of their knowledge of cultivation. Then, Chang Xuan raised his finger and said that this tea was sweet and pleasant, leaving a long aftertaste after drinking it, feeling like you were immersed in warm springs. Chang He had already raised 2 thumbs up and exclaimed that this was definitely the best tea he had ever drunk. Chang Qing looked at them suspiciously, thinking that they couldn't feel that much from a cup of tea, and for some reason he had the feeling that these people wanted to deceive him. Meanwhile, Shuang and Yingxing also felt changes in their bodies. However, they didn't say anything, they just looked at each other and laughed together. Chang He reached deep into his robes, calling out to Mr. Yi. Taking out a small box, he said that this item was a family heirloom. If he liked it, let it be a thank you for taking care of his niece. Chang King thought that the man seemed to realize that his relative had been drinking and eating here for so long, and therefore felt uneasy. Reaching out for the gift, he said there was no need to worry about gifts. Having accepted the box, he said that since it was so, he would not refuse. Chang Xuan irritably said that he should have also brought something useful. These old men got ahead of him. Shuang also wanted to give something to the elder. Chang King began to open the box, and blue light began to pour out from it. He looked inside with anticipation, and the others also showed curiosity. As it turned out, there was a pearl of cold ice inside, which surprised everyone except Chang Qing, who asked what it was. Chang Xuan replied that the cold ice pearl came from the ancient icelands that had accumulated energy for thousands of years. Even a small pearl contained enormous energy. The man noticed that this pearl was the size of a fruit. Old man Li really tried. Shuang said that this pearl could improve the abilities of cultivators with ice root. But for those with other types of spiritual root, contact with it could result in hypothermia and loss of cultivation, and in the worst case, death. Yingxing thought that she was just standing next to him. All could already feel the cold penetrating into his bones. Chang King reached for the pearl and the girls tried to stop him, but he simply took the pearl in his hands without feeling anything. He exclaimed that his hand was cold. It seemed like the thing was cooling itself. After he started tossing it around, he said that it could be used in the summer to cool fruit, and that it was really useful. Everyone else gaped at this frivolity. Chang'e noticed that they didn't even dare to touch her. But in the hands of the master she looked like a toy. Chang Xuan said that the elder really had incredible strength. Bowing to Chang Qing, Chang'e said that his niece had been causing him a lot of trouble lately, and today he decided to take her with him. Chang King responded by moving closer and grabbing the man's hand. And then, unable to hide his jubilation, he asked him if it was true. Sweat ran down the man's forehead as he replied that it was true. Then the elder walked away from him and turned his back to him, thinking about something. Changqing thought with glee that receiving a gift and getting rid of a problem was double happiness. Turning around again, he began to theatrically ask Yingxing if they were really parting so soon. In his fantasy, Yingxing told him not to worry. She would never forget his kindness. Watching this, Chang Xuan thought that he didn't understand what was so special about this ninth princess, that she deserved such attention from the master. But suddenly the girl stepped forward and exclaimed that she was not going anywhere. Feeling his insides breaking, Changqing asked again. The girl bowed to Changqing and said that she would never forget his kindness. Then she turned around and ordered Chang'e to tell her father and mother not to worry. She would stay with Mr. Li for a while longer, and when she wanted to return, she would tell them. Suddenly, Changqing remembered the words he said on the first day of the meeting, and his face turned red. Changqing noticed that Chang'e was a little embarrassed and was about to give in, and he thought that he needed to do something about it urgently. Changqing thought for a moment about what to do and stepped forward, clearing his throat to attract attention. Finally, turning to Yingxing, he said that virtue was above all else. If she really liked staying here, then she could go to her parents and then come back. Chang Xuan intervened in the conversation, saying that he was already at the age when all his relatives had long since turned to dust. So he told the girl to appreciate the time spent with her family because she was still so young. Yingxing wanted to object again, but she couldn't find anything to say. Changqing didn't wait for her words, but simply took the brush in his hand and began to paint a new picture. Various landscapes came to life under his brush, and finally he finished the canvas with incredible words. Seeing this, Changhe, Changxuan, and Shuang's eyes began to shed tears of admiration. This also brought tears to Yingxing's eyes. Her body shook with sobs, and no matter how hard she tried to hold back, tears streamed down her face. At last she exclaimed that she understood his intention, and therefore would return home at once. Changqing, delighted with such an outcome, replied that everything was clear between them, and he began to roll up the canvas. He handed the canvas to the girl, telling her to accept this calligraphy as a final touch. Changhe wiped away his tears and said that just a few lines had awakened memories of old times in him. Master Li had truly reached the heights of art and wisdom, while Changshuan said that his words, like poetry, could shame even those who considered themselves the descendants of ancient scholars in the Central Plains. With their hands folded respectfully, Changhe and Yingxing bowed to Changqing, and the girl said that she would take his advice and return home, but would visit him again soon. Changqing replied with a smile that she should take her escort with her and return, while he himself thought that they should never return. Finally, Yingxing, followed by Changhe, walked away. Looking after them, Changqing thought that it had already been 5 years since he came to this world. The farthest place he has been is the foot of Mount Taishuan. He thought sadly that if it were possible, he would like to travel all over the outside world. Chang Xuan watched Master Li and noticed that he was so polite and courteous. Stroking his beard, he said that, having reached a level that they could not even dream of, he was still ready to personally see them off, ordinary people. And Xuang told him that he was the true image of a great master. Chang Xuan suddenly noticed something and turned away from the girl, not paying any attention to her. With quick steps, under the girl's puzzled gaze, he approached the table. Chang Xuan looked at the canvas that was lying on this table and exclaimed, "It was incredible." It turned out that this was really so. The man touched the canvas and bright sparks shot up from his fingers. And, as had happened before, he immersed himself in this picture, as if he had passed through the entire universe. Landing on some body of water, he noticed that he was in the lands of Taishuan. Looking at the mountain to the side, he noticed with surprise that nearby was the main peak, where the Taishuan temple was located. The man noticed that Master Li was using the power of nature and millions of Taoist formulas. He exclaimed that all this was for the sake of protecting their sacred land. He thought that it was no wonder that so many talented Taoists had gathered here. Even the younger disciples were able to reach the level of a god 1,000 years earlier. Looking at his hand, which was lit up with bright sparks, he thought that perhaps even he would reach his limit in this life. Shuang approached the sect leader and asked him worriedly about what was going on. Finally, after some time, Changshuan spoke again, his body shaking, which made the girl even more excited. Sweat was pouring down the man's face, but a smile played across his face as he shouted that he understood everything. Raising his head to the sky, he laughed loudly, causing tears to flow from his eyes, and he shouted that he realized that Mr. Ye was that legendary ancestor. Walking closer, Shuang asked him if he wanted to say that Mr. Ye was the legendary figure of their sect. Chang Xuan replied that it could not be otherwise. Master Li was certainly the same ancestor who ascended to heaven. Shuang bowed to her mentor and said that she was not smart enough, and therefore asked him to explain it to her. Chang Xuan decided to explain, saying that when he entered the painting, he saw something. He saw a cloud of 5 colors, symbolizing good luck and prosperity. He said that this cloud symbolized luck and prosperity of their sacred land of Taishuan. The girl asked again. She said that she had never felt such powerful energy before. Chang Xuan replied that it was normal. Luck was a mysterious and powerful force. He too had felt it only a few times, but it was too powerful. So powerful that the slightest carelessness can lead to catastrophic consequences. Chang Xuan, stroking his beard, told the disciple to think about who could use the highest divine powers to bless their land of Taishuan with such good fortune. He pointed his finger vigorously and exclaimed that there could be only one answer. He exclaimed that Mr. Ye had come from the higher worlds, and he is the very ancestor that their Taishuan sect has been worshipping for all these many generations. Changqing returned back to the courtyard after finishing seeing off Yingxing and Chang'e. He noticed Chang Xuan and Shuang looking at his painting, Eternal Youth of Taishuan, and he asked them what they thought of it. Chang Xuan did not answer this question, but only came closer, folding his hands in a respectful gesture. And he asked him whether he had painted the sacred mountain Taishuan on this canvas. Something about this question made Changqing nervous, but he still replied that it was true. He frowned and clicked his tongue, noting that they did recognize him. Turning away, he sadly said that 5 years ago he suddenly wanted to visit Mount Taishuan. He remembered how, having reached the sect there, he clung to the man, begging him. With tears in his eyes, he promised that he would grow up and find spiritual roots, and therefore he prayed to be accepted as a disciple. But the great master only replied that he should go away, because he would never take him. Reminiscing about how he decided to infiltrate the sect's territory back then, Changqing said that he knew that Mount Taishuan was the abode of immortals. He said that when he returned, he was inspired, and he painted this picture. However, in reality, it was not because of inspiration, but he was forced to paint this picture when he was beaten in the sect for trespassing. Changqing said that today he looked at his old work in a new way. He said he realized that something was missing from it, so he decided to fix some areas and redraw it again. Chang Xuan was surprised to find that Mr. Ye had already come here 5 years ago. Suddenly, Changqing exclaimed that he would like to drink with both of them, and asked if they drank wine. Having caught hold of these words, Chang Xuan brought his hand to the ring on his hand, and it began to glow with a bright light. Taking out a small jug from it, he said that he had just brought with him a rare wine of the Snow Soul. After heading into the house, Changqing said that since they had such good wine, they should prepare some snacks. Shuang exclaimed that this was the same wine made from the flowers of the Snow Soul growing on the 1,000-year-old mountains, and it is obtained only once every 1,000 years, but can be bought for a lot of money. Chang Xuan replied that it was true and it wasn't for everyone, and even he at his level could only drink 3 cups at most. If Mr. Ye wasn't in the mood to drink, he wouldn't have gotten it. After a while, the guests had already sat down at the table, and Changqing brought out the last plate of food. The pot was still steaming when the man placed it on the table. Changqing smiled and named all the dishes on the table, saying that they were all his signature dishes. Chang Xuan and Shuang began to examine the treats with interest and admiration. Shuang asked the master if even these pieces of meat were filled with spiritual energy. Chang Xuan picked up a piece of meat with his chopsticks and said that it was definitely demonic energy. The man noticed that this energy was so pure, definitely from a higher demon, although in fact it was only boar meat. Changqing, watching the guests, wondered whether he was going to eat it all or just watch. Finally, the guests tasted the appetizers, and a wave of pleasure once again swept through their bodies. Giving Master Li a thumbs up, Chang Xuan exclaimed that he was truly a master. The man began to eat the snacks, thinking that this blood and meat of the higher demon was comparable to an elixir. Then he decided to add some snow wine to all this to make it even better. Xuan, already tipsy and full, asked what kind of wine it was. Suddenly she hit her face on the table. Changqing noticed with surprise that she had drunk from 1 cup, and he thought about how he wanted her not to die here. Chang Xuan was also already red from drinking and exclaimed that this student was too impatient, and he himself thought that all this was not for a small cultivator, but for a great master like him. Turning to Changqing, the man told him to ignore her and continue eating, and so they drank another cup of wine together. After emptying the cup, Changqing noticed that the wine had a grassy aroma, and he asked it whether it had a health-promoting effect. Also finishing the bowl, without looking as collected as Changqing, Chang Xuan noticed that the elder was perceptive. Mr. Ye told the man to state his demands if he had any, since he had brought such wine. And he himself slyly thought about the fact that he just didn't have any money. Chang Xuan thought that he was amazed, and then cleared his throat, saying that then he would not hide it, and that painting was indeed a masterpiece. But suddenly he stopped short, thinking that he couldn't ask for the painting so directly. And Changqing thought that he had already accepted the gift by drinking the wine. Finally, Changshuan decided to ask about the painting, but Changqing outdid him, exclaiming that he had given him this painting. He smiled and said that the painting was one of his favorites, but if he liked it, he could have it. Changshuan asked hesitantly, thinking that he couldn't help but know the significance of this painting to Taishuan, but he was giving it to him. The man thought that it seemed like he had already figured out the identity of Taishuan's main mentor a long time ago. He began to thank Mr. Li in his mind for protecting him, and said that he would not let him down. While Changqing wondered what that old man was muttering again, he had better stay away. Meanwhile, Yingxing had already reached home, the palace of the great emperor. She entered the main hall where the emperor was, and the herald announced her arrival and the arrival of Liu Changhe. The servant ran up to the emperor and told Liu Changhe that since he had arrived, he obviously had important news. Yingxing waved her hand at the emperor and asked him to listen, and Liu Changhe politely greeted the emperor. The emperor of Great Yan, Yan Zunian, noticed that they had finally returned, and he mentally noted that the ninth princess's skills had improved greatly. Yingxing clung to her father, exclaiming that she had missed him so much, and he asked her if she had caused trouble again and returned with an escort. Frowning, the girl exclaimed that everything was not like that at all. She said that this time she really met an outstanding master. Zunian asked his daughter what level this master was. The girl waved her hand towards Changhe and exclaimed that he should ask the head of the Liu residence about this if he didn't believe her. Liu Changhe bowed to the emperor and said that he could confirm that the ninth princess was telling the truth, and it was he who escorted her back. He said he did it not only because of the princess's point, but also to tell him important news as soon as possible. Zunnian looked at the man seriously and told him to speak. After listening to the man's story, he said that he did not give it up, that within the Great Yan there were such powerful recluses. Looking at Chang'e, he asked him what level he thought this master was. Chang'e replied that it was impossible to determine, because the elder's house, although simple, had treasures at every step. However, he did not feel his presence in cultivation at all. The man said that if he was not mistaken, then this elder had already reached the highest level, or had come from the higher world. Zunnian asked again in surprise, and Yingxing exclaimed that this was terrible news. The emperor thought that if there was such a powerful person within the Great Yan, it would definitely become a secret, for no kingdom can afford to reveal such information. Yingxing thought that Master Li was a powerful recluse, but not a celestial being from their higher world. Suddenly she thought that if he was a celestial being, then what was the connection between him and her? She smiled, thinking that her father didn't yet know that the celestial had proposed to her. But then she changed her train of thought again and, embarrassed, wondered whether he really had feelings for her. The emperor asked Chang'e if it was possible that he would go to him immediately after this, and he might want to use him as his pawn. This plan surprised the man, but he replied that it was quite possible. The emperor looked at his daughter and said that Elder Li might be planning to control him through his love for her in order to rule over all of Great Yan and expand his influence. Yingxing quickly objected, saying that this was impossible. He didn't know Mr. Li. He was elegant and good-natured, not that kind of person at all. The man replied that she was still young and inexperienced. There were many cultivators who seemed kind but were cold and ruthless inside, especially someone like this senior. The emperor called the guards and ordered them to take him and the ninth princess to the eldest ancestor. Accompanied by several guards, Zunnian and Yingxing reached another house. The girl continued to defend Changqing, saying that he was not like that. The emperor said that he did not want to harm him. He just wanted to make sure she was safe. Still sulking at him, the girl asked again, to which he replied that it was so. Yingxing thought that she knew that she was unworthy of Mr. Li, but she would not allow anyone to doubt her, not even her father. The emperor reminded her that she had icy properties since birth, a rare gift. That's why the eldest ancestor named her Yan Yingxing. On her birthday, he said that she would bring prosperity to these lands, and therefore she must be protected. Stroking his daughter's hair, the emperor said that she was the only one among the princes and princesses of Great Yan who had been blessed by the eldest ancestor. He said that therefore he had to ensure her safety. The girl asked him if he really wanted to put her in an awkward position, to which he told her that it was time to go. The emperor and Yingxing entered the dimly lit chambers. The girl immediately raised her hands, folding them in a polite gesture. She and her father respectfully greeted the eldest ancestor by bowing to him. Great Yan's eldest ancestor, Tianshan, noticed that Yingxing had returned to the capital with considerable experience and fortune. The girl replied that within the Great Yan she had met an elder, and everything that had happened was thanks to his instructions. Stroking his beard, Tianshan asked who this elder was. Yingxing replied that he taught her music, chess, calligraphy, and painting, and the rest she didn't know. Tianshan didn't ask if she could describe him. The girl replied that this senior did not reveal his status to her. She only knew that his name was Ye Changqing. The man asked again as if trying to remember the name. But suddenly he felt something that surprised him. As it turned out, it was some kind of new aura that surrounded the princess's body. He said that this name was not familiar to him, but in the princess's body he felt another source of energy. Obviously she received it from him, and therefore from a very powerful one. The emperor said that the head of the Liu residence also met with this elder, and Tianshan told him to tell him more details. Zunian said that he was said to be hiding in Xiaojin. His house is full of treasures and opportunities. He even keeps a Demon King-level black dog. Tianshan asked whether there was such a person within Taishuan, and the emperor replied that he was worried because by sheltering Yingxing, he could use her to manipulate the Great Yan and him, the Great Ancestor. After bowing, Zunnian asked the eldest ancestor to check on Yingxing to ensure her safety. The eldest ancestor told the princess to come closer, and his fingers glowed with a bright light. With these two fingers, he touched the girl's forehead, and the light became even brighter. And suddenly, new energy came out of the girl's body and began to fly around the room, illuminating everything around. The emperor asked his ancestor why there was such strange energy here, to which he only noted that it was the nature of ice, and now the energy had two sources of energy. Yingxing looked at her new energy in surprise, not knowing about its existence before. Tianshan asked if this elder was able to awaken her second source. Yingxing asked if she now had two sources. The great ancestor cried out, asking the princess to tell him more about this man. The girl replied that, as her father had said, this elder was indeed powerful, but if he wanted to use her to control the Great Yan, it was impossible. The emperor asked his daughter why she was so protective of a stranger, to which she replied that it was not so. Lord Ye had taken her in without knowing her identity. He was simply teaching her different things. But now she understands that it was because of the energy in that place, and the instructions that she had a second source. Tianshan told the girl not to speak thoughtlessly. She knew how difficult it was to grow a spiritual root with external force, let alone a second one. The emperor agreed with him, saying that then everyone would have two roots. The girl exclaimed that she could prove it. She would immediately bring them his calligraphy that he had given her. Meanwhile, Changqing and Changshuan were still drinking wine. Changqing volunteered to pour another cup for Changshuan, in response to which Changshuan began to stop him, saying that one more cup and he would definitely get drunk. Mr. Ye said that he would drink it anyway, but he thought that this old man was such a weakling that he couldn't even drink half a cup. Changshuan said that he noticed a chessboard with a very complex arrangement in his garden and believed that he had achieved mastery in chess. As he emptied the jug, Changqing replied boredly that he knew little. Seizing the opportunity, the man said he had a rare chess problem and asked him if he wanted to solve it. Changqing replied to show him, and he immediately took out a scroll. Unrolling the scroll, Changshuan said, "This task is called 4 Flowers Underwater." The man began to watch Master Ye as he began to study the scroll, thinking that old man Ziking had given him hundreds of years to decide. After some time, he exclaimed that he was asking for instructions from his elder. Changqing muttered that this was a rare chess problem, but then he asked, discouraged, if that was really the whole task. Changshuan exclaimed that he had not been able to solve it for decades. Changqing twisted his face and thought that this was an elementary task for beginner chess players, but cultivators called it an incredible task. He wondered what they usually did then. After bowing, Changshuan asked him if he could show him how to solve it. Looking at the scroll again, Changqing thought with disappointment that he now realized that there were no strong chess players in the cultivation world. Scratching his chin, he grinned mysteriously and exclaimed that it would be impressive. Following these words, he quickly jumped up from his seat, placing the scroll with the task on the table. Walking out from behind the table, he waved his hand at Changshuan, telling him to follow him. The man obediently followed his elder, who stopped next to the board. Suddenly, the hieroglyphs on the board began to glow with a bright light, radiating energy. The words, "Every move is filled with life force," sounded in Changshuan's mind. Changshuan exclaimed that the elder's chessboard was definitely the sacred artifact, Divine Machine. Looking at the problem on paper again, Changqing said that this chess problem required various solutions, of which the most difficult and significant were 12 moves. He told Chang Xuan that he would teach him the 4 most important moves today. He started to say that he would have to learn the other 8 on his own, but Chang Xuan immediately understood what he meant. Chongqing just nodded his head, thinking that this was all his carelessness. Otherwise, how could he forget about such an important aspect? Meanwhile, Yingxing had already brought that very calligraphy of Changqing to the great ancestor and her father. Tianshan began to read lines from this calligraphy. Zun Nian, listening to these lines, thought that by visiting the eldest ancestor, firstly, he wanted to ensure Yingxing's safety, and secondly, he wanted to use his power to determine the level of this person in order to develop an appropriate strategy. The emperor noticed that the great ancestor's hands were shaking, and he thought that just the calligraphy from this elder seemed like a real treasure to the elder ancestor. A shudder ran through the body of the man who was reading this calligraphy as he read the last line. Tears ran from his eyes as he said that he had been cultivating for several thousand years, first seeking immortality and long life, then well-being for the great Yan and peace for the whole world, but he had forgotten about those around him. While folding the calligraphy, he said that this elder had put his Taoist meaning into the calligraphy, and it brought him back to his roots of cultivation. Cultivation is self-improvement of not only the body but also the soul. The emperor thought that the elder ancestor understood this on an emotional level. The eldest ancestor called out to Yingxing, who was standing next to him. Pulling the calligraphy back to her, he told her to thank this elder for it if she had the opportunity. Stroking his beard again, he said that calligraphy alone had broken down his internal barriers, and if nothing changed, he would soon be able to reach a new level. Zun Nian asked his ancestor in surprise if this was true. Yingxing asked her ancestor if he wanted to thank him so much, then why didn't he visit him himself? Tianshan turned his head sharply to look at the girl and asked her what she was talking about. The girl happily reported that before she left, Mr. Ye had already agreed for her to come back and visit him again. Intrigued by this, the elder ancestor asked her if this was true, to which the girl replied that it was. The emperor hastened to intervene in this conversation, shouting that this should not be done. It seemed to him that there was something in this. He asked if there was such luck in the world that this man had such power, because he not only gave Yingxing the second spiritual root, but also agreed to accept them at any time. He said that usually powerful beings would use moments like these to manipulate events, so he was worried that he was using Yingxing to lure them all into a trap. Tianshan interrupted this monologue by shouting loudly for him to stop, and he asked the emperor how he could be the emperor of Great Yan, being so narrow-minded. The eldest ancestor exclaimed in annoyance that this elder had presented the Great Yan with a real treasure, and he dared to doubt his intentions. It was simply ridiculous. Yingxing quickly defended her father, saying that he was not that kind of person at all. He only cared about the Great Yan. Tianshan replied that if this were not so, there would be no point in the position of emperor. Addressing the emperor by name, Tianshan said that he had not yet reached the required level and therefore did not understand everything. He said that using weakness to manipulate is the approach of those who have been stuck at one level for thousands of years and cannot break through further. This elder one has definitely reached the highest point of perfection. As the saying goes, the great art is in simplicity. Such elders, instead of being players, prefer to remain hidden in everyday life, observing the world with a smile. Zun Nian immediately fell to his knees and began to bow, shouting that he realized his mistake. He exclaimed that if the eldest ancestor was going to visit this elder, he would prepare worthy gifts later. The elder ancestor replied that it was fine if he hugged, but people like Elder Li probably did not attach importance to material things. Therefore, it is necessary to organize a reception for the elder in the capital. And the emperor immediately gave the order to prepare for this reception, and therefore the construction of pavilions began. The construction of a statue of the elder Yi was in preparation. The news spread through the streets that 3 days later, on September 6th, all the subjects of Great Yan were to gather at Jade Hill for a ceremony, and the people were immediately in a state of talk. Someone said that the whole city had to build pavilions in 3 days, and it looks like it was called the Changzhong Pavilions. As it turned out, someone was secretly watching and listening to all these conversations. This man thought that something suspicious was going on, and therefore it was necessary to return and report to His Majesty. Sometime later, this man left the Great Yan and reached his state. Someone informed the advisors that many Changzhong pavilions were being built within the Great Yan, and he asked who knew what they were. The advisors turned their heads, wondering what Zun Nian was planning and whether this was another trick by old Yan Tianshan to confuse them. One of the advisors approached His Highness and asked him to increase the number of scouts to find out the truth. Meanwhile, this news about the construction of the pavilions reached the state of Guten, Emperor Guten slammed the table, shouting that these spies were useless if they couldn't get information. The advisor tried to calm him down by saying that although they didn't know the identity of this senior yet, such honors were clearly not intended for an ordinary cultivator. The only one who this can be is a great Taoist who is on the threshold of ascension or an already great person from the higher worlds. The emperor asked his advisors what they should do. The advisor said that in his humble opinion, it would be necessary to send more scouts to thoroughly investigate this matter. 3 days passed like this, and Zun Nian was already standing near the new pavilion. He said that Senior Li's pavilion was almost completed, and then asked Senior Ancestor to inspect it. A maid approached the emperor and said that the eldest ancestor was on the verge of a breakthrough, so he should be careful and not be careless. The emperor replied that he understood, while 2 spies watched him. One spy told another that His Majesty was right. Yan Tianshan was indeed on the verge of a breakthrough. Another spy asked if His Majesty didn't suspect that Yan Zunian was up to something. Then the first one asked whose side he was on. A scuffle broke out among the spies, while the emperor turned around to report to Yan Tianshan. Crowds of people had already gathered at the top of the mountain, waiting for the ceremony to begin. In the middle of the square stood a huge statue, which was hidden by a red cloth. Among the people, someone said that such grand works are only for those who have brought great benefit to the great Yan. The heralds announced that the emperor and the 9th princess had arrived, and their subjects immediately fell to their knees. Zun Nian immediately ordered them to rise. He told the people that he knew they had many questions about why he had organized such a grand construction project in the capital, building the Changzhong Pavilion and erecting a statue of the elder Li. But the matter is very important, and all that can be said is that the elder Changzhong has rendered a great service to their state, and this service will influence the future of the empire for tens of thousands of years. Questions immediately began to circulate among the people about who this elder was and whether he was immortal. The spies immediately noticed that now the great Yan was probably under the protection of the immortal, because the order for construction came straight from the palace from that ancient elder. They joyfully noticed that this ancient old man was still alive, and so they decided to quickly return to the sovereign. Zun Nian then gave the order to the Yellow Master to begin. The Yellow Master opened the scroll and read that September 6th was a favorable day for all affairs, and that evil omens should be avoided. Suddenly, he shouted that the Changzhong Pavilion was completed. The emperor approached the statue and began to pull the cloth off it. And before the eyes of the people appeared an incredible, huge statue of Mr. Li, with a naked torso, made of gold. A glow emanated from the postcards under his armpits. The emperor immediately asked what this was. What was happening here? The order was given to immediately protect the emperor, but this radiance had already reached the crowd. And suddenly they exclaimed that they were so pleased they felt full of strength. The emperor noticed that no statue had ever emitted such a divine presence before. He asked whether Senior Li was so great that he stood out even among immortals. The crowd suddenly noticed rainbow clouds in the sky, and they immediately shouted that this statue had called them, bringing them heavenly blessings. But suddenly the skies darkened, opened up, and lightning flashed from the clouds. The crowd wondered why the rainbow clouds and thunder had appeared, but then someone shouted that it was a sign from heaven and they needed to bow down. Yingzheng exclaimed that such omens were not common and asked her father if they should call the elder Liao, to which he replied that they should wait and see what happened. Soon the skies brightened again and sunlight illuminated the earth. The rainbow clouds in the sky shone even brighter, astonishing all the people below. 3 figures of people appeared from the clouds, descending from the sky. Zun Nian noticed that it was a miracle. But was Yao the result of Senior Comrade Ye's actions with Lu Yu and the Golden Body? Suddenly, a servant called him and said that after his return to the imperial palace, it was clear that his brother had reached the heavenly heights, and the state of the Great Tao was in order, so there was no doubt that the Great One was going to break through. The emperor was delighted by this news and exclaimed that the Qin clan's ascent to the highest realms would be closer. The sunlight illuminated the sky in the distance where Changqing's house was. Zun Nian and Yingxing bowed and asked Great Comrade Ye for help. The emperor said that if one day the ancestral emperor reached the highest realms, their great empire would enjoy eternal peace. Meanwhile, after a few days, news of this event reached the old city district. Emperor Guten slammed his hand on the table and shouted that old man Lao Er really wasn't dead. He asked the spies if there was any other news. The spies replied that only small things remained. Now the great Yan has a great master who has achieved perfection. This man established the golden sky of Yiluyu, and the heavens gave signs. They say that the old man from the Yan Empire also received advice from this man. The emperor listened to this news calmly and nodded. But then he realized what he had heard and understood, that this was clearly not a trifle. He grabbed some writings from the table and threw them at the spies, hitting them right in the heads. The emperor's capillaries burst with anger, and he shouted for this group of idiots to be thrown out of here. As the night approached, news of the ceremony reached the Jia Empire. Emperor Xia noted that it seemed like Su Xiang had indeed received good fortune last year. An advisor said that he thought the rise of Great Yan was inevitable. Another said that if the old man from the imperial palace successfully broke through, the other 3 states would be under his control. And a third said that the most important thing now was to find out who this senior comrade Ye was. The advisors began to argue among themselves about who they should form an alliance with, each proposing his own candidate. Emperor Xia listened calmly to these disputes, frowning more and more. Meanwhile, Changqing had a dream. A voice in his head said that 1,000 years ago, the lands of the central region were divided into 7 states. An age of chaos and upheaval arrived, and then a man of exceptional strength appeared. He took charge and established order, and thus 4 great states arose. The ancestors of these 4 great ancient states wanted to erect a statue of this great man, to establish a golden body and a temple to honor him for thousands of years. But for some unknown reason, he died without illness. Upon seeing the news of his own death, Changqing jumped out of bed, exclaiming that he did not want to see it. He sat up in bed with a jerk, his breathing rapid and heavy. Scratching his cheek, he noticed that the wolf's answer was too beautiful. He even dreamed that they erected a statue for him and brought sacrifices to him, and suddenly he became a great man. Getting out of bed and stretching, he said that if he didn't have common sense, he would believe it. As he approached the door, he noticed that sleep had really helped him. It seemed he was sleeping better. As he walked out into the yard, he thought that the old master had already left a month ago. Sitting down at the table, he thought that he was wondering if he had found out anything about the 4 dragons that release water. Frowning, Changqing remembered that he had only taught him 4 methods. After looking through the gifts that were sent to him, he sighed heavily. There was a stone and a tablet on his table, and Changqing wondered who could have sent him such a thing. He noticed that someone had sent him a stone and an amulet, but he hadn't even shown himself. He remembered how he taught Changshuan the playing techniques while constantly scolding him. He wondered why it was so difficult to understand the basics of this school. Changqing sighed and said that in the great mystical book, there is a place for those with strong spirits, those who move forward without looking back. He exclaimed that if he had a strong foundation and high intelligence, he would have long ago become an unrivaled master of the entire cultivation world. Following these, Changqing waved his hand, throwing the amulet aside. Putting the stone on the table, Changqing sadly said that he was now his rival. Humming something to himself, Changqing stood up from the table and walked away, and suddenly small cracks appeared on the stone. The cracks became larger and larger, and a bright light began to shine around the stone. Changqing entered his office, his notes illuminated by the sun. Stretching, he said that the morning was the most productive time, and therefore, it was time to start training. He ran his brush across the paper, and suddenly red sparks flew from his ink. Looking at the brush in confusion, Changqing asked if there were any discipline problems and if the recording paper was missing. Shaking his brush, he looked back at his canvas. Looking at the hieroglyphs, he noticed that golden smoke appeared around them. This sight made Changqing frown slightly. He picked up his brush again to lay out his work, thinking that he was actually making progress. Bright sparks of light flew from the canvas in different directions. Changqing happily noticed that the golden smoke continued to appear. A loud, joyful cry came from Changqing's office, saying that it was all his golden finger, causing everyone around to become frightened. The Black Emperor, half asleep, thought that his master was so powerful that even his finger was turning golden. Mr. Ye, looking even more animated, exclaimed that it was time to return to training. After some time, more symbols appeared on the canvas, glowing with golden smoke. However, Changqing was not going to stop there and continued to practice calligraphy. And suddenly a blue tornado appeared somewhere near the man's house. Raising his head from the canvas, Changqing saw that same blue tornado in the window. He wondered if he had caused this phenomenon. But this did not stop him, and he continued training. Meanwhile, thunder rumbled, and bright lightning flashed in the sky. Changqing took a break and went outside to get a better look at this weather phenomenon. And the lightning became brighter and stronger, and they were already striking the ground. But soon the sky cleared, and Changqing exclaimed that the heavens had not abandoned him. He said that when a true strong master is born into this world, he will summon heavenly signs, and with one mental effort one can move across the sky and earth, overcoming any obstacles. Believing in his abilities, he raised his hand up, shouting the spell, "Fly!"